Beth Rudden, thank you for being with me today. And the first thing I noticed in your image in the background is you have, is it a cello behind you?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So did you get started early with music?
So I have been playing the cello ever since I was, 5 or 6 or 7, where we had a lot of music in school, and orchestra was part of the electives that you could take. And grew up in a place where, being a part of an orchestra, whether it's a chamber orchestra or like a full orchestra, and then went to a performing arts high school. So I played in the pit for a lot of
I didn't
musicals.
realize that. Okay, great. Yeah.
Yes. I went to school on a music scholarship at Florida State University, and was recently in New Orleans, where we would go over to New Orleans and learn to improv by playing in jazz bands. And I was, looking at, thinking about my daughter doing that in a couple years. And
Great.
it was a very different time. But yeah, music is very much a part of my life. I did, make a conscious decision where I knew it would take me 16 hours a day in a practice room, and I wasn't that committed. So
Mhm.
it was one of those, like, I love it, but it wasn't something that I felt I needed to do at a young age. So it was, and that's a, I don't know how other people do it, but in my world, it was always like, you have to commit to something, and you should choose to do that or not.
But you have such a broad base to your education. You know, you talk about your parents and how you
Mhm.
won the lottery with them.
Yes.
And and you know that is almost the opposite of what I have been reading and hearing over the
Mhm.
last 4 or 5 years about you don't kids, you don't need to go to college. Don't do what you love. Scott Galloway recently was
Mhm.
talking about that sort of thing. It seems to me like you did just the opposite, and you've become enormously successful as a result of that. Archaeology and anthropology being examples in your
Mhm.
background, in your education.
Well, I mean, I actually do agree with Scott Galloway that it was easier to get into college, back, 20, 30 years, 30 years ago.
Right.
So, the thing that I have always, been very aware of is, I went to a state school, and my parents, they paid for 4 years of college for all four of us.
Mhm.
And that was a massive investment in, in both money, as well as, we knew it growing up, where it's like, no, you can't have a car, you're paying for college, like it was something that was part of our understanding and our ethos. And I also worked, in college, I've worked all my life. And the thing about, like, liberal arts specifically is that, that you got to take the first 2 years to explore
Mhm.
what kind of degree you wanted, and be able to take all kinds of different things to understand, the vast amount of different disciplines that there are, and make that something that's really, really good. So, and I recently re-listened to Scott Galloway's TED Talk, and I think he even says this in here. He's like, he got in with like a 2.7, and that is unheard of right now,
Right.
where, colleges are, are the ability to get into college is, and the ability for the college to be looked at as good, is based on how many kids they don't, how exclusive they are. And
Right.
that's the entire, that was not around 30 years ago. That's
Right.
completely changed.
Yeah.
And so I would definitely say, though, that I did have friends, who were immigrants, who were told by their parents they had to go into engineering or medicine, or, become a lawyer, or, it was something that, it was not like they didn't have the privilege and the choice to go to a liberal arts school and do that. So that's why, very definitely won the lottery, that, my parents were focused on us having a college education, and a college education in something that we loved. And I don't, you're right, I don't hear that enough. I would love to hear that more.
Well, I think the fact that you were able to do what you loved, you were
Yeah,
good at it, made you who you are today.
absolutely.
And I loved hearing about the story of when you got your master's degree. You came to the University of Denver and you did your thesis in the Ludlow tent colony site. Talk
That's
about that,
right.
if you would, a little bit.
So in 1914, the Colorado miners in the coke mines in Ludlow, which is right outside of Trinidad, Colorado, so it's down south, and it is at the time, it was a lot of immigrants, where there were a lot of people who came to America and were actually, part of the mining company and part of the mining town. And they were striking because they were paid in something called script, where script was not really currency. It was just money they could only use at the store that the company owned. And the company owned the town, and the company owned the mail, and the company owned all of these things that, it's really hard for people to kind of consider what's going on there. And hold on for 1 second.
Sure.
The So miners were being paid in scripts, and they started striking because that was something that, the news at it, labor rights, and they called it yellow jacket journalism. And you can think of like Upton Sinclair, who, really made such a huge difference so that we wouldn't put children in factories or put children in mines to work.
Right.
This idea that you had children meant that you could increase your family's income because you could put your children to work. All of these things that, history, people don't understand that the social biases of the times are inherent within everything. People don't see that there's anything wrong with that, but looking back on it, you're like, what? How did they do this? So the Colorado National Guard was called in by the coal mining company. And this is a seminal point in US history, because corporations should not be able to control or mandate a control of the Colorado National Guard, of a state commissioned militia or a state commissioned army. That is very, and this is one of those turning points in history. And what unfortunately happened is it was a massacre. And so all of the miners and their children and their wives were massacred, and they had this tent colony, and they dug tunnels. And they had, so, going through the archaeology of this, it was very much, and, this is where archaeology for me is, it's a lot of things, but it's the ability to really do your best to find artifacts, to use statistics for, bullet projections, and, how far down in the strata that you're doing it. So it's very, scientific in a lot of objective mathematical ways that anthropology may or may not be, depending on your point of view. And what I loved about it is the stories. And I was looking at, the female class consciousness, and the women who were part of these towns, who were, married to the miners, or having the children. And I was looking at how that was impacted in that time, and, what were the female voices. And what I think we all know intuitively, or at least can understand from a common sense standpoint, is that a lot of the history had always been written from the male point of view. And so what I wanted to do was give voice, and, start to understand what was the female point of view. And, you had Molly Brown, who is a survivor of the Titanic, in the Molly Brown house. And so you had a lot of other kind of like Colorado history that I could draw from. And, I spent I don't know, hours, days, months, weeks in the, in the National History Museum and the library, looking through all of these old documents and all of the old newspapers and everything. But at the end of the day, the thing that I learned the most is history is about telling stories. And so much of those stories are reflective of the person who is telling them, not necessarily about what that story is about. And
Mhm.
so I was imbuing my own social bias, hundreds of years later, or 100 years. It was actually 90, so about 80, 90 years later, I was imbuing my, 1994 kind of understanding of what was happening in, the Ludlow tent colony. And having that understanding of I have my own biases, I have my own social understanding and what is right and what is wrong, my own value systems, my memes, tropes, my mores, what I wear, how I think, the language I use, all of that was so different than the language even 80 years ago.
Mhm.
And so that was something that did not have the words for, but as I went on in my career and would do data science and look at data, it was something I inherently understood. And I was also doing ethnography, which is a form of qualitative science. And the first step when you do an ethnography is to talk about how you, the person, feels before you take somebody's story. So you're writing down a record of what you were doing and whether you were hungover or whether you were in a bad mood, because it would impact how you take somebody's story.
Right,
And that's what I wanted to see in data scientists. Like I wanted to see that understanding of themselves and their own bias
right.
in handling data.
When you graduated, you stayed in Colorado and
Mm-hmm.
worked in the Boulder facility for IBM for a number of years. And there were
I did.
lots of changes going on during that period of time. Yeah, including we didn't have enough IT talent here in the
Mm-hmm.
United States, and we had to bring people in from other countries.
Mm-hmm.
Had an impact on you, didn't it?
And so I did have probably about 4 or 5 years of doing some .com consulting and working in the .com era of the telecom industry.
Yes.
And I was a programmer. And so I had programming, and again, I made a choice where I said, I need to pay back my student loans, not go incur more. And so I went to work, and I did have a professor that influenced me a great deal. I asked her why I got like a B on a paper, and she said, "Oh, you need to just grow up." And that was a harsh, loving kind of thing. Later, I could look back and say, "Wow, that made a lot of sense." But at the time, I was, you know, not very happy with that. But I did it, and I grew up. And when I was in the Boulder facility, and the Boulder facility is the largest data center that IBM held, and it was full of customer service desk agents and full of people who were servicing the managed services division of IBM, which was the $34 billion managed services division. And we were doing strategic outsourcing, where we were taking over large companies like service desks, because we wanted Citibank to be bankers. We didn't want them managing service desks. We wanted Gap to run clothing stores, not be managing service desks. So they would outsource that to IBM, and then we would rebadge all the people. And in doing that, we had just a wonderful mixture because, as you said, we didn't have enough IT talent. So IBM would have people from India come live in Boulder, and that's who I grew up with. And I love like Srinivas Chilapenta and Arun Balasubramanian, and the language and the culture, and I loved having just this really kind of great mixture. And when you're working in your younger part of your career, you're having, you're spending 12, 13 hours a day with people. So, you're often like you're growing up with them. We were having babies and, getting our kids into school and like meeting, for cricket and, doing dinners together. And like, it was such I have a lot of people who always ask, they're like, how did you know that you were going to go through this? And I was like, just have fun with the people that you're around. Make sure that you like who you're working with because you're spending a lot of time with them.
Right.
And, the eventually some of the people from India, they would go back to India. And we had such a great bond that the teams that we were building, we had a follow the sun mentality where, we had such great communication and trust and, bonding that we would have a large global team, 200-300 people, and we were all working in concert, in connection,
Yes.
because the follow the sun is like, we would speak to folks in India right as they were going into dinner time, which is very important. And then they would kind of come back for a couple hours. And then, we would do the US based, East Coast hours, and then Australia in the afternoon. It was just literally following the sun. And we had incredible success because we had such a strong global team.
Hmm. That's great. So where did you go from there? So you were in the Boulder facility for how long? And that was the nature of your work during that period of time. What came
Yeah.
next for you work-wise?
So I went into the office most of for about 10 years, 10, 12 years. So there was a good decade.
Right.
And then, really started getting bigger in IBM and going through, it, it, I didn't know other people didn't have these progressions. So I'm like, it was a natural progression. I became a team lead and then, a team, STSM, which is a senior technical staff member, which is an appointment. And
Yeah.
I got certifications for IT architecture and information systems, and you learn data warehousing and multidimensional data warehousing, and then not only SQL and like all of these. So Google was so instrumental in building up something that we call Hadoop or HDFS or Hadoop file systems.
Right.
And why that was so instrumental is because the two gentlemen who started Google, they wanted to organize the information in the world. They didn't have mainframes. They didn't have large honking computers, right?
Right.
They had to make compute that would be distributed over a lot of smaller kinds of devices. I kind of joke around and I'm like, they had to make their toaster part of the compute that they
Right.
had to use. They had the necessity to innovate.
Right.
And so, when you have like, map reduce and being able to distribute the load, and you would have a mother node that would distribute the load over all of these different systems, we came up with the Hadoop file system, which is just astounding because instead of having to have large computers to do the compute, you could distribute the load over many small computers. That is a ginormous advancement that happened in computing at that time. And like being around where it happened, it also changed the nature of data storage. So we went into not only SQL systems or no SQL systems, and then graph databases, which still just blow my mind because of the n dimensionality of it. I was really growing up, getting bigger because it was important to get bigger so that I could do more for the team.
Yes.
And that is something that I learned at an early age, is to go for what I can give, is, to do it because I've always been pretty intrepid. If I have knowledge that there's like an injustice to fight,
Right.
or knowledge that I had the team to support, and at the time, people they were, unfortunately going through some cost cutting measures, and they were laying off some of the data engineers and data scientists and statisticians and linguists. And I'm like, we need these people. And this is back in, 2009, 2010, after the financial collapse.
Right.
I think that, that was a real motivator for me, is to get the executives to understand that reporting and data and analytics and, the advent and the early advent of AI and machine learning and the application of these tools, we needed these people. We couldn't be laying them off. Like, this is, very, now it seems, again, absurd, but they didn't know, we don't know, we didn't know then what we know now. So I started the data science profession because I wanted data scientists to be seen and valued. And, the euphemism of like, I don't feel valued by my organization is a signal, right,
Right.
to the executives to be like, hey, pay attention. And IBM is a incredible, like, they're just glorious in their complexity.
Yes.
And so we really fought the battle to instantiate an experience-based data science profession. All of us have to renew our certifications every 3 years. It is something where you can't become certified unless you can explain to someone like me who is certified that what a full cycle implementation of the science and data and scientific method to solve a business problem. Got that accredited through the open group, and then really went for a technical executive, which is a distinguished engineer appointment. And did a lot of work in talent and transformation, where I grew up to become the chief data officer of that large managed services division. And we had to quickly upskill and reskill 25% of the talent. So we had to figure out a way to get 110,000 people in 175 countries to motivate themselves to upskill and reskill them. And we
Mm.
had about 16 months to do it. We did it. We got 23,000 people into certified, accredited, certified, things that they could prove. Hey, I became a Red Hat engineer. That's a proctored exam. Those are hard. I became a data scientist through the experience-based profession that we started.
Yes.
And that was 16 months. We got 23,000 people up and motivated. And
Astounding.
then
Yeah.
it rolled off that division as Kyndryl, which is now still doing a lot of the managed services. And then I went and I spent 2 years, 2.5 years in IBM consulting, learning go to market, sales enablement, delivery enablement. I ran two P&Ls where I had to increase our content management, which is like content digitization, and it uses some fascinating vision AI and perceptrons to be able to read off things and digitize information. But we got that from 90 million to 150 million in 9 months. And then we established the basis of AI at scale with a trustworthy AI foundation and an ethical AI governance, and worked in that was 425 million, and we were able to increase that by 20%, which was enormous. And when I left IBM, I felt like I had learned everything that I needed to learn. And it was really hard because we were running around the world educating the market on what responsible AI looked like. And I was always like, I don't want to scale AI unless it's responsible. So
Mm.
that was where I really made sure that people also understood a data scientist needs a software engineer. A software engineer needs a DevSecOps person. A DevSecOps person needs a data engineer. All of this, it's a team sport.
Right.
And so I was really, again, educating, some of the sales executives that this isn't like, you can't have one person build a model once and say, okay, this is great, let's go sell that. That doesn't work. It's a whole process, because you have to do a lot of things. And that was that was when I left in July of 22, and then I opened Bast in October because I wanted to build libraries and developer tools so that they didn't have to, have a software engineer, a data engineer, some form of a DevSecOps person that could do cloud services, an AI expert, potentially like a UI UX. That's like $700,000 worth of talent that you have to put together and hope that they all work together so that you can have an AI system that's yours. And that's still true today, by the way. Like, even though we have the access to generative AI through APIs, it's not enough, because you need to have an information system that has a feedback mechanism to retrain things. All of these, it takes people. And I was working with one client recently, and she's like, my CTO told me I need 21 people. And I go, I think you'll need maybe 2 or 3 using our libraries, because it allows you to skip some of those steps. It allows you to get further down the line so that you can build your own custom AI and your custom IP that you own
Right.
using our libraries. And so that's what I wanted to see the world do.
Let's back up for just a moment and talk about what is Bast AI for? Who
Mm.
is it for?
Right now, it's for companies that want an alternative to black box AI. So for companies who would like artificial intelligence that shows its work and has the explainability built in,
Yes.
and artificial intelligence that they can build on top of their own data, and they can do it on their premise, in their, behind their firewall. You can use the data that people have. And back in the day, we used to call this dark data. That was the term. And it was all of the unstructured data that exists in corporations behind their firewalls.
Right.
And so I wanted to build tools that developers could use to be able to enable them to take the data behind their firewall, really process it, organize it, put it into a version system of record, and then being able to retrieve it using artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
And we built the data pipelines to use NLP, and that natural language processing, or the NLP. It has 3 aspects to it, where you have understanding, or natural language understanding, natural language classification, and natural language generation.
Mhm.
And what my area of expertise is in natural language understanding. And why I like that particular area is because my curiosity is always about, how do we really understand what somebody is saying, and how do we really understand it against a context. And so we have grounded context in something called an ontology, which is a graph model. And so we can understand what somebody is saying against a context. And without that context, you don't know what somebody is really talking about.
Mhm.
That's why most anthropologists, most people, they define their terms so that
Mhm.
everybody can have a context by which you can understand. And then with generative AI, we have generation. And so what we do is, in our data pipeline, we process the unstructured data, and then we say, how do you want to understand this context of the data? And so we build an ontology using that data to say, hey, we're going to understand it from this particular context, like from a financial context, or from a marketing context, or from a talent context, or
Right.
from, so you have the various understanding. And that's so crucial, because you have to use that same NLU to process what a human is asking for.
Mhm.
So when, I am not building general AI. everything that we're doing is in that realm of the narrow domain specific AI. But what generative AI did is like put a rocket on our butt. We
Yeah,
can now
sure.
do that so much faster
Right.
because generating syntactically correct, semantically correct paragraphs, that's hard. It's
Mhm.
really hard to do. And in fact, back in the day when we did like Q&A pair, but we've been building chatbots for 20 years, and you would take a set of questions and a set of answers, and you'd give it to IT, and you'd have all of your IT people each develop 100 variations of the question and 100 variations of the answer. All
Right.
of that now we can use Gen AI for. And
Right.
that's exactly what we do is we now have a generative tool to kind of complete that picture of that NLU, NLC, and NLG. Now it's true NLP, it's true processing, because we have that generative part to add to our understanding part.
Which industries will adopt it first, do you think?
Um, I am intrepid in going after things that are very near and dear to me, like medics and war zones, and seeing if we can reduce cognitive load of our service members who are fighting for our freedom to vote.
Your
I
husband.
think my husband, my son, I think that the what I know to be true with the artificial intelligence that I create
Yeah.
is that it's fully auditable.
Right.
And because it's fully auditable, I can give a medic who is in theater or in a war zone the ability to pull up the next step in a protocol, or pull up something that will help him triage, or just be able to maybe even have an audit trail of what's going on, so they don't have to relive that when they have to go back and make all of their reports.
Yes.
And the 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 way that we started is actually, that was one of our very first use cases, is we wanted to show that you could do both deterministic AI as well as indeterministic AI. And we used the Pararescue Medical Handbook, and that was our unstructured text. We broke it up into a version system of record. So it's the 8th edition. If the 9th edition comes through, we process it. And then what we do is we fill it into a container, and then we ship it, because we don't need internet connectivity. And that's also how we do deterministic. We know for sure that the facts tell us that the acute abdomen procedure is part of a diagnostic tool, or something that the medic can apply, whereas pain is part of a symptom. And these complex things don't sound very difficult, but with our technology, we know that for fact. We know that for 100% certainty, because we have a human in the loop always to make sure that the concept hierarchies, that, this is a symptom, this is a treatment. And, that's super important. And so we can do that over and over and over again. We've been working with Maryville University in being able to get more nurses on the front line by really helping students stay in class.
Mhm.
We've been working with an excellent partner, Career Highways, which is helping underserved kiddos from 16 to 26 get into jobs that are in the area, by showing them how to take the skills that they have and how those skills might translate to the construction, retail, or manufacturing job down the street. We are looking at, different cancer centers where an oncologist might give a diagnosis to somebody whose first language is not English, and needs to understand or interact with some of the studies that are there, and allow them to say, give me an analogy of this diagnosis in Vietnamese, or what does this term mean, or where can I find more information for this. And these are to me some of the best ways to use artificial intelligence, is to be able to provide people not only like a way to interact in a different language, or a way to be able to understand how to recommend with confidence, or scale the ability to process large amounts of unstructured data quickly, but to give people the understanding that this comes from a source that they trust, and that they have the understanding of the lineage and provenance, that this comes from this picture on this page. And that's so interesting to me, because like, what if we could accelerate having plumbers, electricians, construction workers, manufacturers, the trades in our country? And we can really make the people who are working with their hands, we can make more care providers, we can make more teachers. We can have people who are doing that human interaction.
Right.
Let's free them up from having to carry all of the things in their brain, or doing all of the paperwork. That's something, I've done a lot of podcasts, and I didn't realize this, but I started this all the way back in February when I did South by Southwest EDU. And I asked this question, and I said, why can't teachers become the highest paid profession in the United States?
Yes.
Why not?
Yeah.
And that's where I think giving people artificial intelligence that they trust, they understand how it works, their data is theirs, it's not being used to train large models that you don't really know what is being trained for what. They That's what to me, it's like I want it as prolific as GPS, where currently, GPS is something that we all rely on so much that most of us follow our GPS. We don't even look at the road anymore.
Right.
And, having lived through that transition, I think, we can live through a transition where we're just like, what's the next step? How do I apply a tourniquet? Or, how do I know this is the right dosage of medicine to give to somebody? All of these things, like disaster response toolkits. I have a lot of plans.
Beth, you were working for a very large company and supporting large companies in
Mhm.
that you did. Now, within the last 24 months, you've become a founder and a CEO of a small company. You're an entrepreneur.
Mhm.
What was that experience like for you? And how do you spend your time today?
Um, I mean, the highs are highs and the lows are lows. It is both thrilling as well as terrifying. And it is it is not for the faint of heart. I
I'm laughing because, of course, I've been there.
and then we all recognize each other. I think the ones that do it, and the ones that do it well, you know, we know that I used to say in IBM, and would be shaping large deals. And, I always love the big game hunters, because they would be like, look, your deal is going to be all over the floor before it comes together. It's just the way it kind of works.
Right.
I heard this yesterday, is I'm in that messy middle of, trying to get some investment funding, and, in that negotiating stage. And because this is unknown for me, there's 50 more steps that I didn't even realize need to happen. So I think I think I'm over the hill, and I'm like, nope, there's a whole mountain behind that. So it's that tenacity. But somebody said this yesterday, I kind of like it. There's a messy hairball at the end of every single deal, and you got to have the tenacity to swallow it.
We're coming back to cats.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. But I mean, I love, I mean, that's so true, because humans are unconstrained, and doing business is about building relationships. I've known this for a very long time. And so when you're doing a deal, you can, we agree, okay, we agree, okay, we agree, nope, got to go back. We agree. It's like you have to agree at every level. You have to build consensus. You have to really trust that the person is going to do what they say. You
Right.
have to make sure that you have like the best advice, but at the end of the day you got to make a decision,
Mhm.
and you have to make hard decisions that are taking into account your fiduciary responsibility, taking into account what is the mission, what do you really want.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but it took me a long time to even know and be able to articulate, what do I want? What do I want to do? What do I want to become? What do I want for the company? What does my 2 to 5 years look like? All of those things takes, I would say I was doing a lot of that in IBM, but I didn't have as much control as I do. So I will say this: the stress is enormous. I had shingles in my eyeball twice in the last 2 years. Like
Oh,
it takes an enormous amount out of you. But I would also tell you that it's a different feeling of stress, because being in a corporation, there was so much I could not control. And it was almost heartbreaking,
mm,
because you knew that you had information, that you had to do things that you cannot tell the rest of the people. When you're an entrepreneur, you have a lot more control, and you have that unilateral decision making capability. You have that. um, I surround myself with lots of people because I take information in at, and I'm very explicit about having a diverse, advisory board, and a diverse set of mentors, and, collected them along the way, in my roles in IBM. And I, I, I texted one this morning and I'm like, I channeled you. So it's like I have all of that to go for me. And that's where it's so different, but it's also, I don't know if I could have done this without all of the support and experience that I received in working for a very large company. And then from a technical standpoint, the biggest surprise is being told my entire career that I was never technical enough, that I was too good at sales, so I couldn't possibly be technical enough.
that's amazing.
And I'm like, okay. But I mean, it it happened, and it's Thursday, so that's how the world works. And
Yes.
then I walk out of IBM, and John, the world is nowhere near as technical as I thought that everybody was. And so that was a ginormous surprise for me.
Mhm. I have so much in my head now. One thing I do want to say to you is, Beth, the world is going to be a better place because you have made this decision. I know that. And that says, I mean, the company is the vehicle by which you're going to accomplish those goals. And those goals are
Yeah.
going to shift and change over
Mhm.
time. But we're so lucky to have you. I don't mean that as a concluding statement because I have some more questions for you, but we're lucky to have you in this community of entrepreneurs and founders, and you're going to do just amazing things. I know
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah, I know it. um, I lost my train of thought a little bit, but I want to also talk to you about how the technology world within the United States, if you can define it
Mhm.
as such,
Sure.
how how it relates in foreign relations. Because
Yeah.
my my volunteer work is with the Denver Council on Foreign Relations.
Mhm. Yep.
Um, Fritz Mayer is the chairman of our
Yep.
committee, and I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that.
Um, I really appreciate this question, and I'm going to do it with a framework about a story, and because this is important, so I really want people to hear. We Part of IBM is the Institute of Business Value, and it is a major qualitative study and research organization that is part of the IBM machine. And we did a study in, I will find the actual dates, I think 2019, 2020. And what we did is we looked at 16 layers of management over 4,000 different corporations, companies, teams, people. And we produced an incredible report called AI Ethics Action Report. And I really wanted it to be actionable. So we listed out actions that the CEO can take, actions that the CISO can take. And I really wanted it to be prescriptive.
Mm-hmm.
And what we couldn't figure out how to get into this report. And I will do my best to tell this story in a way that does not. So there's four quadrants, and what we found is we could generally classify every human, every team, every company, every country into one of these four quadrants. And this is about the questions were all about, like, do you have an ethics leader? What do you think of AI ethics? Do your people understand AI ethics? Do you think responsible AI is necessary? All of these sort of like qualitative questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved the sort of that vertical stratification of getting people from the mailroom all the way up to the CEO, because it's super important, and that's what's changed. Jim Whitehurst, was the CEO of Red Hat, he has a great TED Talk about how the information now, the guy in the mailroom has as much or potentially more information than the CEO. So
Mm-hmm.
that's totally changed.
Mm-hmm.
So these four quadrants. First quadrant is myopic. Put AI on it because I'll get the budget. Everybody wants it. This is what everybody else is doing. We have to do it. It's very myopic. Second quadrant is risk-based. I'm in a financial industry, a medical industry, a healthcare industry. I have regulations I have to follow. So I have to put some ethics or guardrails into what I'm doing with artificial intelligence or machine learning, because I have to follow regulations and I have to follow stress tests. The third one is opportunistic. And this is where a lot of us really pushed hard, where we needed people to understand how the artificial intelligence worked to get adoption. So that people would adopt the tools that we were doing so that we could get the change management necessary. Because if people don't use the tools, you don't get the ROI. Like, you don't get the automation. It doesn't happen. And we live in a world where it is about users using the tools. It's not about procurement, buying the software and putting it on a shelf. The last one was strategic. And strategic is, you don't have an ethics board. You don't have data stewards or advocates for explainability. You don't have any of the like governance, because every single human in your organization knows that that's what they have to do. And the only group that was in that strategic quadrant was China, because everyone in China knows that they do not build artificial intelligence or machine learning, or companies that build artificial intelligence or machine learning or models, without the Chinese government, without explaining it to the Chinese government. And that is where I think the United States is not understanding the global landscape that we are in. The people in the Middle East, the Saudis, are very interested in AI ethics. Very, very interested. I've done work in Singapore. I've done work in Abu Dhabi. I've done work in Japan and China. And the viewpoint of AI ethics is about what is the governance to be set up, not how does this stuff work. And we are in the United States still making many large investments on black box models that are very difficult to disambiguate. And there is still the assumption that you need large data and large compute to statistically brute force the answer. And in other countries, they're 10 steps down the road in the application of artificial intelligence because there's some explainability on what they're putting in.
Yep.
And this to me is why I wake up every day, John, and I want the world to know that you can build really good practical AI if it by with small data and with small compute
Right.
by sanitizing your inputs, making sure you know what's put in, being transparent about what your training data is, and making sure that training data has the relevant signals to be able to respond to whatever target you're trying to achieve. And I mean, I talk about this so much because I want people to know I started the data science the profession with a statistician and a mathematician. And we did it because we saw so many people irresponsibly just shoving a bunch of data into a neural net and getting an answer. And that answer looked great, looked like 99.9, but they didn't know what they put in and they didn't know if that answer was right or going to be right all the time. And
Mhm.
they couldn't tell us what the other 0.1% meant,
Mm.
which meant it wasn't replicable. It wasn't science. They didn't have the test retest reliability.
Right.
So I think the United States, my skip forward, I think large language models should be like libraries. And every single city has a librarian who
Mhm.
already is part of the local order of of that city to curate the books in the library for that city. We
Mhm.
should do the same thing where the librarians are the stewards of the large language models, building those language models to say, this is the culture of the Bronx. This is the culture of Denver. This is the culture of Ludlow. This
Mm.
is, that to me makes so much, it's a utility.
Right.
And we should train data scientists like electricians.
Right. Right.
If you're going to put code, electrical code or electricity into my house, I want it to go against the code.
Right.
And I want that to have governance.
Mm. Your enthusiasm about this topic and this question is palpable. And I just looked at the clock and I want to be respectful of your time. I feel like we're at the starting point and we've come to the end of our time today. But Beth, I'm a lucky guy to have met you, and I hope we can continue the discussion. And I've got a whole bunch of ideas that I'd like to run by you about how we might be able to do that, and so that the world gets to know you better. So,
I really appreciate your questions very much, John. Thank you.
thank you, Beth.